Well, after my little experiment last week, I decided to return to the press conference approach to preaching my sermons. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. Very excited today because we begin a new series on the book of Esther. I've never preached or taught through Esther before, so this is going to be a new experience for me. And I don't know the last time you went through Esther. In fact, if you're a man and you've been through Esther recently, I don't know what to say to that. I mean, ladies, you've probably been through Esther as part of a ladies' Bible class or something similar, but Esther is not a book that really receives a lot of attention in a primary Sunday school class, or certainly oftentimes in a sermon series. But I believe that this is a study that is going to be very encouraging and very enriching for us. The book of Esther is a book that has a few interesting tidbits that are true of it. First of all, as some of you know, the word God or anything like it does not occur once in the Hebrew text of the book of Esther. The Greek version of Esther is a little longer, and the Septuagint translators saw fit to add God on occasion because they felt like that was important. But as far as we know, the original text of Esther never contained the word God. We also have no idea who wrote Esther, but it was someone, obviously, who was very familiar with Persian customs and the times and the culture of that day. Esther, though, is a book that I think is incredibly important for God's people in any age. Esther, in some ways, is very similar to the book of Daniel, because it talks about how God's people ought to live in exile, how God's people ought to live in a hostile culture, in a hostile land. The book of Esther is primarily about the providence of God. And I think it's intriguing that while God does not occur anywhere in the book in an explicit sense, I think after the study of this book, you will recognize that his fingerprints are all over every single page. And so we're going to be talking about Esther chapter 1 this morning in a lesson that I have entitled Storm Rider. My favorite poem is one written many years ago in the late 18th century by a British poet by the name of William Cowper. Mr. Cowper was a very prolific poet and also a very prolific hymn writer. He wrote hundreds of hymns by my understanding. And in fact, he was best friends with John Newton, who wrote the beloved hymn, Amazing Grace. Mr. Cowper, throughout his entire adult life, struggled mightily with depression. At one point, he was in an asylum for treatment. He tried to commit suicide on a numerous basis. One particular evening, when he was living in London, he was despairing once more, as he often did, and he hailed a coach to come and pick him up at his house and drive him to London Bridge, where he was going to throw himself off and drown in the river. He was going to throw himself to his death. It was a very foggy night, and the coachman that was driving him became lost in the fog and had no idea where he was. And Mr. Cowper eventually realized that it's taking way too long to get to London Bridge, and he was very angry at the coachman, and he said, "What's going on?" And the coachman acknowledged, I have no idea where we are. The fog is too thick. And he said, "Well, just let me out here." And so Mr. Cowper gets out of the coach and starts walking, only to realize he's just a few steps away from his own house. You see, the coachman in the fog had been going round and round and round in a circle. When he walked into his door, Mr. Cowper realized that he had been spared from death that night due to the providence of God. And that night, before he went to sleep, he sat down and he wrote in a very important poem. The poem has gone by many names throughout the years. The name that I know it under is simply called Providence. And you have likely heard at least the opening line of this poem. The first verse goes something like this: God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea, and he rides upon the storm. Christians believe that our God is not only the King of the universe, but is in sovereign control of everything. Christians believe that we can sleep peacefully at night because we believe our God is large and in charge. But sometimes events in our world challenge that particular thinking. Times of unrest challenge that thinking. It's easy sometimes to watch the news and think, man, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. Think about what our country has gone through the last 14 months. The attempted assassination of a former president, now our current president, a prominent political figure in our culture, assassinated this past Wednesday in Utah. So many things have happened just in the last... We bombed Iran. So many things have happened in the last 14 months alone. And we have no idea what's going to come in the next 14 months, let alone the next 10, 20, 30 years. We live in very interesting times. But you know what? These haven't been the only times of unrest in world history. I think many of us that are sitting in the audience today would acknowledge that, yes, I believe that God is large and in charge. But sometimes we witness the goings-on of powerful people, and we may start to wonder. In the past, we've prayed, Jesus, take the wheel. And now sometimes it seems he's asleep at the wheel. We look at the goings-on and the decisions of powerful people, and we wonder, is God really staying on top of everything that's happening? And maybe if you don't think that when it comes to world events or national events, do you believe the same when it comes to your own personal life? When bad things happen, when bad people do bad things, are you convinced that God reigns even over those small things comparatively? My point is that I believe some Christians mistakenly believe that, yes, God is concerned about international war and preventing international world war. So far he's 0 for 2 on that. God's concerned about war. God's concerned about famine. God's concerned about global pandemics. But is God really focused on the day-to-day events of my life, especially the things that go bad? But if I whine to someone about what's going wrong in my life, they would just sit there and kind of roll their eyes, be like, you, me, and both, buddy, we got problems. Everybody's got problems. As I've talked before, does God reign sovereign over the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days that we often have, like the little boy Alexander in the children's book, and we want to pack up and move to Australia? Is God really sovereign over those events? Let me say something else before we get into the text. I wonder how many Christians view God's sovereignty and view God's providence in the sense that, well, things happen in the world, good or bad, and God will make a sea change or a correction to them as they're happening to make sure they all align with His will. That God is watching the events of the world go on, and then He's, as they're happening, kind of moving things just a little bit. He's massaging, He's nudging, He's fiddling until everything conforms to His will. I don't know that that's entirely accurate. The reason I say that is because God has always known the end from the beginning. I do not believe that anything happens unless the Lord has ordained that it would happen. And so instead of watching events unfold and nudging things here and there as we go along, I prefer a view that says that God has orchestrated all of these things with intent from the beginning to work out His perfect will in the world. You see, that gives me a lot of confidence. Because it's not like, okay, Jesus fell asleep at the wheel and He's no longer nudging and massaging and fiddling things to conform to His will. No. Things aren't unfolding at all unless God has ordained them already. From the beginning, long before Genesis 1, the world is not unraveling. The world has not gone amok. But as we've often talked about, human stupidity and human evil have always been on the leash of God's sovereignty. When we open up the book of Esther, we are introduced to a particular king of Persia. In the Bible, his name is Ahasuerus. That is the pronunciation of his Hebrew name. That's the Hebrew version of his Persian name, which I promise you I'm not going to try and pronounce at all because I've got no idea. But according to Greek sources, the Greeks knew him as Xerxes the First. And in the NIV, they actually changed his name from Ahasuerus to Xerxes. And so if your Bible has Ahasuerus, then we're talking about Xerxes the First. This particular king of Persia was the son of Darius the Great and the grandson of Cyrus the Great. Now, Xerxes never went by Xerxes the Great. Apparently, he didn't have a very good publicist, but he went simply by Xerxes the First. Again, that's how the Greeks knew him. And he lived from about 518 to 465. In fact, he was on the throne, I believe, from around 486 to 465. The events of the book of Esther take place from around 483 BC to 473 BC. And the events of Esther chapter 1 take place in 483 BC. We're going to open up the book of Esther, and number 1 this morning, we're going to look at the details in verses 1 through 10 of chapter 1. They read thus: "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush." Now, the rest of these 10 verses are going to go on to really spotlight just how incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful Xerxes is. I mean, the narrator is going to hammer this point home, and halfway through this passage, you're going to say to yourself, okay, I get the point. He's really rich and he's really powerful. But this is what our narrator wants us to understand. Xerxes is rich and Xerxes is powerful. Xerxes is rich and Xerxes is powerful. What is Xerxes, Pierre? He's rich and he's powerful. Okay, notice how he continues. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And what the narrator really means is that he has come into a time of peace and security because he has very recently, again, according to Greek historic sources, we know that he has just put down a revolt in Egypt. And so Xerxes has just exercised his power in his realm. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. I mean, anybody who is anybody, the who's who of the kingdom is here. For a full 180 days, 6 months, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. He's rich and he's powerful. Now, I don't know what it's like to go to a party for 6 months. Quite frankly, I'm so introverted that when I go to a party, after about 20 minutes, I'm trying to come up with an excuse why I need to leave. I can't imagine going to a party for 6 months. But this party lasted 6 months. And by the way, what do you have to have in order to throw a party that lasts 6 months? You got to be rich, and I would imagine pretty powerful because, I mean, that's a lot of caterers for 6 months party. When these days were over, here's the second party. The king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. Because why not? After you've thrown a banquet for 6 months, why not we just extend it a week and invite different people? And that's what he did. In the enclosed garden of the king's palace. We've actually found this archaeologically. It was basically a large gazebo type structure, and there were beautiful private gardens surrounding this particular gazebo, this enclosed garden in the king's palace. He did this for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Everybody who served in his palace were invited. And here's the reason. In 483 BC, Xerxes is planning a massive campaign against the city-states of Greece. This is the Persian-Greco War that's about to begin. It will be in a couple of years that the famous Spartan 300 will make their final stand, make their stand to slow Xerxes' advance. They will make their stand in the Battle of Thermopylae. This event in chapter 1 is on the eve of the beginning of this Grecian war that Xerxes launches. And so if you're going to be on campaign in Greece for a couple of years, you kind of want to, wine and dine the home folks so that there's not a revolt back home while you're gone. So this is what he's doing. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. What does this mean? He's rich and he's powerful. In fact, nowhere else in the Bible does the narrator so specifically paint a scene like this one. The narrator is going into unprecedented detail to show us that he's rich and he is powerful. There were couches of gold and silver. Apparently leather wasn't good enough, not even exotic leather. All right, he's got to have gold and silver couches on a mosaic pavement of, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce that word, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. I mean, this guy is what? Rich, and there we go. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. I don't know if these were like, door prizes or swag that people got to take home as a souvenir. And the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. He's rich, he's powerful, and on this occasion, he's incredibly generous. Boy, what a king. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Now, the reason this is important is because it was Persian custom. You only drank when the king drank. That was it. Only when the king started drinking wine could you start drinking wine. He says, we're going to do away with that rule for this particular feast. It's going to be open bar. You can drink as much as you want, whenever you want. I mean, he is really pulling out all the stops here. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. We have no record of Vashti in extra-biblical historical sources. In fact, Herodotus, the Greek historian that tells us so much about Xerxes and his reign, claims that his queen was named Amestris. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. Either Herodotus got his information wrong, which he did from time to time, admittedly, or Amestris is simply the Persian or Greek name, and her Hebrew name is Vashti or Vashti. But this is Xerxes' queen. On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, I mean, he's a little, not exactly sober here. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and I'm not going to pronounce all those names. Russ, would you pronounce all those names for me? All the difficult names I give to Russ here. So we've come to a point where he's rich, he's powerful, he's throwing a party, and then suddenly, at the very end of the week, he's 3 sheets to the wind. That's really what it means. And he calls his 7 eunuchs and he wants them to do something. And that's when we come to the second point, the demand in verse 11. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. I think the text actually says she was very beautiful. Jewish tradition says that she was being asked to come and provocatively parade herself in front of Xerxes and his nobles, wearing nothing but her royal crown. This is what Jewish tradition preserves. The reason is that there was a debate going. Again, this is a legend. We don't know this for sure. But there was a debate going on at this party that the Persians said their women were better looking. The Medians said their women were better looking. The Babylonians were saying their women were better looking. And Xerxes is Persian, and his wife is Persian. And so he's going to say, I'm going to settle this once and for all. I'm going to show everybody how good looking my Persian wife is. And that's why he has her come and do that. This is his demand. The real point, though, that I want to make with this is we're not given a reason why he wanted her to come other than she's very beautiful. And number 3, the defiance we see in the next verse. When the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come, and then the king became furious and burned with anger. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that Xerxes was very hot-tempered and also a pretty bad skirt chaser, which again fits the biblical picture here. But he was very hot-tempered. The point that I want to make is that we are not given a reason why she refuses to come. And I believe it's because in this context, the reason is immaterial. The fact is that she has defied a king who is rich and powerful. It doesn't matter why he wanted her to come, and it doesn't matter why she refused. She has brought the king to a boiling point because he is rich and all-powerful, the all-ruling God of the world, and his own wife won't do what he says do. And that's when we come to a decision. Beginning in verse 13, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. Russ, read those names for me. Thank you, Russ. The 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. Real quick, there are a lot of people who say that the story of Esther is a fictional fairy tale, not real. I believe that Esther is a historical reality. One of the reasons I believe that it's true is because the actual names of the king's eunuchs and the king's advisors are all mentioned in this particular chapter. It's the narrator's way of saying, hey, these guys were all real. I'm grounding this in historical fact by giving people's names. You can go look them up in the royal archives. I find that interesting. But here, they are the king's advisors. They have special access to him. Verse 15, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked them. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the province of King Xerxes. She hasn't just offended you, your majesty, she's offended us. We've been wronged because she refused to do your bidding. I mean, when a wife is out of line and not obeying her husband, that is a national security threat. We got to call all the royal advisors to do something about this. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women. And I'm sitting here going, how? It's not like all the Persian women in the realm are on the same mission board. They're not all in a Facebook group. A lot of their logic doesn't make sense here. But it's going to become known, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. So I'm not going to make your dinner. I'm not going to fold your clothes, and I'm not picking your dirty underwear up from the bathroom floor anymore. I mean, we are going to have an international riot, O king, if you don't do something about this and put this queen in her place. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. Because, king, you're all rich and all powerful, and we serve you, and if you can't be obeyed by your own wife, it's not going to be good for us either. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. I mean, these guys are really working it, aren't they? We just can't have this. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of the Persian Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her a royal position to someone else who is better than she. And then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. O king, your majesty, all rich and powerful, you got to nip it in the bud. You need to pass a law. And notice she's not divorced. She's not banished. She's simply stripped of all of her rights and privileges as queen. She's still in the harem, but she can no longer have an audience with the king. She's no longer in his favor. She's been demoted. I mean, demoted. This is exactly what King Xerxes decides to do in his decree. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all the parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household using his native tongue. And that's the story. Throughout the entire chapter, it has been emphasized that Xerxes is both and powerful. The Christians, God's people, know that's not the whole story. I love this quote from one commentator on Esther. In Esther, we are introduced to the mightiest king in the world at the height of his glory. Anywhere one looked, his wealth and power were evident. Even the Greeks, who hated him more than any man, were impressed with his splendor. Yet in the book of Esther, he is only the second power. His word has authority, but there is another word that dictates human affairs, speaks through the mouths of counselors, gives favor to Jewish maidens, robs kings of sleep, and inspires terror in the enemies of God's people. In the book of Esther, there is a power that is hidden from human eyes that manipulates events in ways that even the world's greatest monarch cannot resist. Or, as another commentator put it, Xerxes is God. That is how the book of Esther begins, but that is not how it will end. I want to make two quick points from this chapter as we wrap up today. Number one, God is in complete control of how history unfolds. Recently, we had a class on the intertestamental period in which we went through Daniel chapter 11. All of these prophecies that were made, just a remarkable number of prophecies made in Daniel 11, all of them came true, very specific prophecies. And the point that I made in that class was that God was in control of the unfolding of history during the intertestamental period, but he's actually been in control of the unfolding of all of history. And I don't think that any of us would deny that, but think specifically about what we're talking about. That rebellion that Xerxes had just put down in Egypt, that had been God's doing. This war that he's about to go into against the Greeks, God was behind that as well. His humiliating defeat by the Greeks 3 years later that sends him coming home is going to be God's doing. And he comes home and he's just been defeated and he's like, I'm kind of tired of sleeping by myself. And so he decides in chapter 2, I'm going to hold a beauty pageant to find me a new queen. God was in control of that development as well. But more specifically this morning, I want us to understand that even small, seemingly insignificant events are directed by God. That party that Xerxes threw for 6 months, God's doing. All of this incredibly just ostentatious wealth and power that he had, God's doing. This pretty little gazebo, God's doing. This 7-week or 7-day party for all the servants in the palace, God's doing. Getting plastered for 7 days, God's doing. The cups, the couches, God's doing. A drunken king wanting his wife to come and perhaps parade provocatively in front of his nobles, God's doing. A queen that's defiant and says, I'm not going to humiliate myself like that. And I'm not going to embarrass you because you don't even know what's going on. You're drunk. God's doing. 7 counselors that have this bright idea, this overreaction, and suggest that Vashti be deposed, demoted, and a whole letter sent out to everybody throughout the kingdom in their own language. Extra, extra, read all about it. Breaking news. You are in control of your wife. Thus says the king. That little ridiculous edict, God's doing. We're going to find in this chapter, in this book of Esther, that God is in control of even small, seemingly insignificant events. And it's always for a purpose. And in Esther, it was for the purpose of preserving his people from complete extermination. So the question to you and I is, do you believe that God is large and in charge? Well, Michael, yes. Of big world events, He's in charge of world wars, and he's got tyrants and despots and evil men on a leash, and he's in charge of hunger and famine on a global scale. He's got power over pandemics. But do you believe that God is working in your life providentially when something just doesn't go your way? When something happens that you didn't foresee and it leaves you aggravated? Something happens that maybe you thought possibly would happen, but surely God would never let that happen. God must be punishing me. I'm having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. Do you believe that God is working those events intentionally for your good and His glory? The book of Esther says that He is. As we close, I want to go back to the poem that we read at the very beginning, the first couple of lines anyway. God moves in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea, and He rides upon the storm. You see, the Canaanites and others in the land of Israel that were pagans believed that Baal, the storm god, rode his chariot in the storms that came across the land and brought the rains for a dry area. The Bible says that it's God who rides upon the storm. And no, it doesn't necessarily mean a literal storm, a meteorological event. What it's really saying is that God is large and in charge. And here particularly, I believe it talks about how that in the storms of life, God is riding in supreme command of all those things. It comes down to how much faith do you have that God knows exactly what He's doing? And it's not like someone has done something rude or obnoxious or evil and thrown things off a little bit, so He's got a nudge and He's got a massage and He's got a fiddle to get things back on track. It's not like somebody does something and God's up in heaven going, I cannot believe this. The moron. Gabriel, get in here. I need you to fix this. I've got a 9 o'clock tea time with Moses that I can't miss. Somebody needs to do something about this and get this back on track. That is not how God responds, because God doesn't respond in the conventional way we think about response. God was behind every event from the beginning. He ordained it long before Genesis 1:1, even the small, insignificant events of your and my lives. And if you believe in a good and gracious God, then you can believe, Christian, that He is working everything, even the headaches of your life, not just the heartaches. He's working those for your good and His glory. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian. The Bible says that if you're ready to put your faith in Jesus Christ, turn from your sins and be buried with Him in the waters of baptism, you can leave here this morning as an heir of eternal life. For many more of you, maybe you're here and you are a Christian, you've been struggling. You can come forward publicly and ask for prayers. Never going to discourage that. Come talk to me privately if you wish, and we can pray. But I hope that all of us, in response to this lesson, we'll take some time to reflect in what ways are we struggling to really believe that even the minor headaches, the seemingly insignificant events of life that we kind of think God's too busy to worry about, too busy to be concerned. I don't want to bother God with that. Even those things are happening under His sovereign watch, under His complete control. Even those He has on His leash. And He has sworn to us that He will work everything in heaven and earth for our good in His glory. The passage that Brother Russ read at the beginning of the lesson, Proverbs 21, verse 1. The heart of the king, even one who is rich and powerful. The heart of the king is like water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it in whatever way He wishes. If you need to respond publicly this morning, we invite you to come as together we sing this song to encourage you. Won't you come?